Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for attending this HRE4 Europe webinar. My name is John Kapetanakis, member of the HRE4 Europe team at Aalborg University in Denmark. We are hosting a series of webinars about the HRE4 Europe project funded by the European Union. This is our last webinar scheduled for this autumn and the 15th in total for 2018. Today, Daniel Trier from PlanEnergi, HRE4 Europe partner, will talk about the suggested guidelines to policymakers as these are included in the newly published report guidelines for the energy transition for the energy system transition. Susana Paardekooper, Ph.D. fellow at Aalborg University and member of the modeling team, will give a short introduction to the project and the main results from the heating and cooling strategies. If you have any questions or comments relating to the presentation, please use the relevant box in the sidebar on the right to your screen. We'll have some time to address these before the end of the session. Susana, over to you.
Thank you, John, and also for me, welcome to this webinar series. As John mentioned, this is the one about the guidelines for the energy system transition. And I'll be here just to give a short introduction about the general project and the general results. And then Daniel will dive specifically into these guidelines that were developed in the context of the data and models that were developed in the project. So to start with, this is a slide that we normally start with because it shows the purpose that we have in the Heat Roadmap Europe project. So our wider purpose in the 3-year project is to create the scientific evidence to support the long-term development of energy strategies at local, national, and EU level that will empower us to go to a low-carbon energy system. And the way that we do this is really by quantifying the impact of various alternatives. So a lot of scenario building is happening in the project, and that's a lot of what we've done. When we talk about quantifying in the context of Heat Roadmap Europe, we mean that both from a spatial level, so from a perspective of mapping the heating and cooling sector, but also from an energy modeling perspective. So looking at the energy system and seeing how this development within the heating and cooling system can go. Within Heat Roadmap Europe, we've had 14 partners. And as I mentioned, we're ending our 3-year run. So we've been able to really use a lot of different people's specialities and different expertises from different areas, which is important when we talk about heating and cooling because they build into energy strategies in different ways. So this is also one of the reasons that we're able to develop these guidelines that can really interpret the technical results that we've developed into something that can be applied and can be used and really be there to support the transition towards the results that come out of the technical modeling. So this is not the first time that we've done something like this. This project, Heat Roadmap Europe 4, is the 4th iteration of something which started in 2012. And actually, PlanEnergi was one of the very first partners and has been involved since Heat Roadmap Europe 1. And as you can see from the research questions that are specified here on the slides, we've developed from being a short, quick project only about the role of district heating into really developing integrated, comprehensive low-carbon heating and cooling strategies. So we've moved to a broader perspective in terms of looking at the whole heating and cooling sector, but also towards a more comprehensive approach towards how to develop these and the really strategic part of achieving change and linking the technical results and the quantification that we do to a transition in the energy system. So that's one of the reasons we're very happy to be able to do this today and be able to present these guidelines because it's something that is new to the project and something which we've developed in this iteration in the last 3 years. In terms of the technical results, I'll give a very short overview just because it's not the focus of this webinar and there are a lot of resources on the website that are available if you're interested in this. But roughly speaking, what we see if we compare the scenario development in Heat Roadmap Europe to today is a reduction in primary energy demand, but also a reduction in final energy demand, which means that we're really trying to make the energy system, including the heating and cooling sector, more efficient. We see a high level of electrification with renewables. This happens in a large part in the heating and cooling sector when we talk about heat pumps, but also it has to be considered that the redesign of the heating and cooling sector that we talk about in Heat Roadmap Europe is done within the context of a decarbonizing energy system. So we also have to consider industry and the transport sector there. And when we talk about electrification, specifically the electricity which is necessary there. The other thing we notice is that there's a much higher level of variable renewables. And this is something which becomes really important when we take an energy system perspective, because that's what we're, in many cases, trying to do. Biomass is scarce, and we want to move away from fossil fuels. So the more variable renewables like wind and solar we can integrate into the system, the more efficient and the more socioeconomically viable we can get it. So it's very encouraging to see that this high level of variable renewables. And then the final thing to notice is that the district heating supply has expanded, the light yellow circle right in the center. And one of the things also that Daniel will talk about is the role that these thermal grids can play. We see them really as being a bit of an interconnector between being able to recover different types of energy that are otherwise wasted, and in that way contribute to the reduction in primary energy demand, but also work with the electrification of the heating and cooling sector and the efficiency in the built environment in order to redesign the heating and cooling sector. When we talk about the actual redesign, this is a very short overview of what the scenarios look like. We developed 14 different scenarios for 14 different European countries. So of course, these all vary in different ways to reflect the specificities of those countries. But overall, what we find is that it is possible to decarbonize the heating and cooling sector, but also the energy system, in line with the Paris Agreement as it's agreed today. We reach an 86% reduction in carbon emissions from the energy sector when we compare that to 1990, which is normally the benchmark that we take. And we do that using known and proven technologies. So we use technologies which exist today and which are used in energy systems and in markets today, to really be able to make the point that it's not so much of a technical challenge as much of a transition challenge when we talk about being able to decarbonize in the European Union. In terms of the spatial dimension, as I mentioned before, one of the main quantifications we try to develop is the mapping of the heating and cooling sector. So that means we can start being location specific. What we see everywhere is that deep energy savings, particularly in the built environment, but also in the industry sector, are necessary. We're talking about a 30% reduction in buildings compared to today. In urban areas, we see that district energy networks have a really high potential in order to be able to contribute to this primary energy reduction, but also be able to integrate different types of renewables. And for the EU 14 that we looked at, that's at about 50%. In the remaining areas, we look to heat pumps to supply the remaining heat demand, mainly because they form a really nice link with the electricity sector and work towards this electrification that I mentioned earlier. So this is a very, very short overview of the results of the scenario building work that we did in Heat Roadmap Europe. We have a lot of resources on this on the website. You can see some of them on the left of your slide here. So we have the specific country roadmaps. We also have a kind of overview for the general findings. So we have 15 roadmaps in total. And then we have the thermal atlas, we have the demand profiles when we're talking about the built environment, and we have the energy models. And of course, we have the guidelines, which Daniel will be talking to you about in more detail today. So please feel free to have a look at those. If you have any questions about this or also about what Daniel has to say, then feel free to put them in the entry box to the right of your screen, and then we can talk about them afterwards. And I hope that with that, I've given you a brief enough overview that I can hand over to Daniel, and we can start talking about the guidelines and the different models for the local and the European implementation of this.
Thank you very much, Susana. So I will explain about, say, 3 different reports we've developed addressing, let's say, policymakers at different levels. So the agenda for my part of the presentation is first, how to use the guidelines. This is about the different political levels and the target groups. 3 pillars that we mentioned from time to time in the report, and I'll be referring to those also in this presentation. I'll explain it in a minute. and also then the structure of the guidelines, just to give you a quick introduction to how to interpret the document themselves. Then I've extracted some key messages from those, just to give you a taste of what's in there, with obviously more information that I can provide today in the reports themselves. And then, yeah, time for discussion afterwards. So what and who are these meant for? So we have 3 reports as mentioned, and they all contain recommendations for the energy system transition. So this is when we're talking about guidelines for the energy system transition. This is about how do we reach decarbonization of the energy system as a whole. In the Heat Roadmap Europe project, of course, this is about heating and cooling, but we take everything into account here in terms of electricity and transport as well. So the overall energy system as a whole. And of course, as mentioned, the different levels. So we have the high-level recommendations referring to, for example, EU directives, national frameworks to support the energy transition, also including the country-by-country sections in the report, meaning that we don't only merge the recommendations to overall inputs, but rather also have sections country by country for the 14 focus countries in Heat Roadmap Europe, where we look at the specifics of that of each specific country. Then addressing the challenges on a local and regional level, which is a more practical approach, whereas the international and national level is more focused on the framework conditions and how to support from a higher level policy making decisions. And in terms of the regional and local level, it's more the practical approach, meaning how do you go through the different steps and how can you facilitate this energy transition, being, for example, a municipality. So the 3 pillars that I've been referring to before is, as you see here, energy savings, energy efficiency in general, then efficient low carbon energy supply, so both savings and supply as the first 2, and then applying the thermal networks, being district heating as the main one, but also district cooling. And the figure here is an attempt to try to show how the different pillars are interlinked. Though you'll see the different points also in the report as separate sections that we go through, there are still obvious clear links between them. For example, as you can see on the left-hand side of the figure, that you might improve the efficiency, meaning the coefficient of performance of the heat pumps, if you apply energy savings measures in a building. So in order to get the best outcome as a whole, if you want to apply, for example, low carbon energy supply in the form of a heat pump in a house, it might make sense to refurbish the house to achieve a more efficient heat pump use afterwards. So this is just one example of combining 2 pillars to reach a better total outcome. Similarly, if you want to use excess heat, you might need a district heating network to utilize that. And if the excess heat is a low temperature, you can still use it, but you need a heat pump in a large scale to utilize it. So this is an example of a link between the blue and the red pillars here. So it's not an either or. You really need a joint effort in terms of combining the 3 pillars. And also I should mention that electrification is not excluded here. There's been a big focus on electrification. Even from the very first Heat Roadmap Europe project, we identified that many politicians focus very much on the future as electric, and we shouldn't focus on district heating too much because we'll just electrify everything. Well, we don't say that or claim that we shouldn't electrify the heating and cooling system, but we just say it's not a single solution that will solve everything, because you really need to combine electrification as well as implementing thermal networks, as well as energy efficiency measures to get the most cost-effective suitable result. Case in point, if you just apply more and more wind turbines, at some point you have a mismatch between the supply and demand to an extent where it becomes extremely unfeasible or even possible to maintain the balance in the electricity grid. I'll come back to the use of fluctuating renewables in a second. So the structure of the guidelines here are organized by the pillars I just mentioned. And the content is then described with general recommendations and explanations for the different key messages that we've highlighted in the boxes as you see here on the screen. So we number those just to have it easily recognizable if you flip back and forth through the reports. And then also, as you see here at the bottom, we have direct references to other Heat Roadmap Europe outcomes. Because though it's recommended, every person interested in Heat Roadmap Europe might not read every single document that we created. So to let's say address this point, we've created some key references to the main documents related to a certain recommendation, so that you can easily find, if you read a certain recommendation and the explanation and want further information on that, you can find where can we go into the very details of that, or where do you have the information that backs up these claims or these recommendations. So the scenarios and the work done on building the Heat Roadmap Europe scenarios can be just schematically shown here. In terms of the CO2 emissions we have on the secondary axis, then we can see the starting point is the EU baseline 2015. And then we always compare in terms of CO2 emissions to the 1990 levels. So the current trends and policies for 2030, as proposed in 2016, is then applied to see where will the system go if we do not do more in terms of applying new policies. And that actually reaches some level of CO2 emissions, not enough, but still we're coming some part of the way. It's also interesting because this shows us where we need to, let's say, increase our ambition level and where is it sufficient with the current policies. But the conventional decarbonization is then something we compare with, because this is proposed by others, and we can, from that, try to see how can we improve that with our approach in Heat Roadmap Europe. And as shown here, we can reach 86% CO2 reductions by going with our approach. So related to the pillars, again, we have, in terms of savings, at least in a general level, at least 30% reduction of heating in buildings, and a lot more heat pumps, both small ones in rural areas and large ones in district heating. I could mention also that large heat pumps already today is used also for cooling purposes. So you really see a clear example of the synergy opportunities there. When you use a heat pump to provide cooling, for example, in the industry where you need cooling for vegetables or other things, and connecting that to district heating directly, meaning that you supply cooling directly to the industry, heating directly to the district heating network, and by means of the cheap thermal storages in the district heating network, you can then balance also the electricity grid by operating the heat pump in a suitable way. So this is one example of interconnecting heating, cooling, and electricity by using large-scale heat pumps and district heating. And then the last point here, much more district heating. I'll show this also later with one example, but reach almost half of the heat demand supplied by district heating would be relevant. And in brackets here, I also mentioned that we've identified huge excess heat potentials, but these are not the only means of supplying the district heating. So we should also emphasize that this is not the only conclusion on what should be the supply of decarbonized heat for the district heating. So again, the different documents are focused on different levels, And in terms of the local or regional approach, it's a bit more practically oriented, where we, for example, have this step-by-step approach in terms of identifying possible areas for district heating, and then moving towards the different steps on how can these be, let's say, how can we go step by step towards actually realizing this and planning for the realization of this. Estimating the demands, for example, where we can use one of the tools of Heat Robot Bureau, PETA, calculating the profiles of the demands, thereby estimating the required capacity of the district heating, then modeling the different alternative heat supplies, and creating the investment plan and drafts and calculate the fixed annual system costs, and of course also the operation expenses, thereby coming up with the final budget and compare with alternatives to check can we really compete with alternatives. We have more information on this in the local level report. So general recommendation is, as mentioned before, in terms of we can reach the CO2 emission reductions, for example, 86%. I say, for example, or this is at least, perhaps it might be the better phrase here, because we should highlight also that the Heat Robot Europe solutions do not, let's say, limit our energy system to a certain share of renewables or a certain level of CO2 reduction, but rather is, let's say, one big step ahead, and we start with this, and that's proven, feasible, and possible with existing technologies. But besides this, the system redesign that we recommend at Heat Robot Europe actually enables further implementation of renewables. So this is not an end goal, but rather a way to proceed from there to reach even further decarbonization of the rest of the, let's say, not energy system. Also, the coupling of sectors is essential, as mentioned before, to reach the most cost-effective and low-carbon energy system. And we also suggest balances between decentralized heating and cooling in rural areas and the thermal networks in urban areas. So we do not only say you should apply much more district heating and much more individual heat pumps in rural areas, but we actually identify where should you do this and to which extent should you apply district heating. So we know specifically when and where and to which extent. In terms of the integration of renewables, especially fluctuating renewables, as I mentioned before, well, the combination of the different sectors is really key here, because you can utilize the flexibility in the district heating networks to balance the electricity grid when you get much more fluctuating renewables in there. For example, if you integrate or you establish a lot more wind and PV power, at some point you'll have, if you don't connect this electricity production to the thermal sector, you'll have overproduction to extreme levels at some point, which will either make your electricity system crash or really have problems, or you'll have a huge amount of curtailment of the wind turbines, for example. So in order to make this transition feasible, we can really make sure to integrate the different sectors and utilize such excess electricity for heating, which means that we need to balance this, and the thermal sector really is a key feasible way to balance, to say, utilize this excess electricity, and with the cheap storages we have in the district heating networks, we can use those to balance the supply and demand. So in terms of the recommendations, well, they are, and the let's say, barriers that need to be overcome. It's not only the technical ones, and in terms of the technologies we need to implement, there's a lot of non-technical ways to facilitate the process. So one thing is to raise awareness in terms of both on a broader level in the public opinion, but also in terms of let's say, educating all levels of students. really a common narrative of all Europeans would be a suitable thing that we can focus on and agree on, instead of just choosing when it's feasible or when it's nice to claim that you're green, and then when you're not really focused on this, then you can just choose to forget about this. But this is just to mention that it should really be a common thing that everyone agrees on, that this is really an important thing to combine our efforts to reach this carbon decarbonization. Then improving qualifications and the number of skilled professionals, because in some countries you see suitable infrastructure and suitable level of qualifications of, for example, installers of heat pumps. And in other countries, you might be able to, let's say, call a professional, but he might not be skilled enough to avoid mistakes. And in the heating and cooling sector, for example, individual installations, you can really have a risk of the bad experience, and the mouth-to-mouth is a risk that you really want to avoid. On the other hand, we want to make sure that we have good examples that people hear about and want to apply the same thing in their buildings. In general, bad experiences really is something that people hear about and are afraid to replicate that. So in terms of the planning stage, we should require integrated energy planning and implementation and regular evaluation of the status across all energy sectors and across all governmental levels. So this is again not regarding the technical implementation of units or components, but rather plan ahead, and also to make this as a public thing to combine your efforts on. I'll come back to the planning of the strategic energy planning in a bit also. CO2 taxation could also be a mean to let's say, avoid that fossil fuel based, example given, and boiler operation in individual households are too cheap for people to switch away from. Also, fossil fuel subsidies, direct and indirect, should be stopped immediately. This also includes, for example, incentives to switch to a new gas boiler. It might be a bit more efficient, but once installed, it will take some years before people consider to invest in something green or decarbonized. Meaning that it's really important to act now and not wait until some years, because a lot of the investments, both for individuals and for businesses or industries, take a long time before they are, say, ending their lifetime. So this is something also to consider in terms of fossil fuel boilers and individuals. They should be phased out, and you can start with banning the installation of boilers in new buildings. And in terms of the bigger scale, we should set expiry dates for fossil fuel power production, also for the businesses and utilities to know what can they rely on, how can they make long-term planning, and what to expect in the future, so they do not in a few years from now, for example, invest in new fossil-based power production. One example on the European scale is that the ETS today does not reflect actual cost of emissions. And one example of doing something about that is that you could apply a minimum price level, which should increase over the years, of these allowances, and that could be done by applying some additional adjustment of the current legislation, meaning that you have a market stability reserve, which is one way of trying to keep the price up a bit in terms compared to the current levels. But one option there could be to simply reserve even more allowances and agree that you put allowances in that market stability reserve to a certain extent until you reach a price level. So you have a minimum price level, and you are sure that until that price level is reached, then you put allowances in the market stability reserve. This could give the investors in a bit more reliability, or let's say confidence in what is the cost of allowances in the future as well, at least on a minimum level. And then also in terms of financing, we should really consider the public financing should support the short and long-term energy transition targets. And this should be something which is followed through in all public financing schemes, not only for the energy sector, but something that we agree on that this should be considered facilitating the energy system transition rather than hindering it. In terms of the energy efficiency measures, we should consider that it's not only on the demand side that we should apply savings. It's also important to consider the supply side and well, be aware that both sides are important in this context. In terms of renovations in buildings, we should support deeper thermal renovations because it's very important that if you apply renovation measures or you renovate just to a small step, you might achieve some savings, but in the long term, it might not be enough. And the risk of having, let's say, cheap but to a small extent savings applied is that customers or inhabitants probably do not want to consider savings, deep energy renovation after they first already did the low-hanging fruit part of it. So it could be an important missed opportunity for the deeper renovations if you do not consider those together if you're anyway renovating your house. Again, in terms of the legislation levels, I talked briefly about it before, that you have some different levels and the current legislation on different countries. And we can see that in some countries, the current legislation is more or less enough in terms of reaching the suitable energy efficiency levels or energy savings measures. But other countries really need to increase their ambition level. So the focus in those countries that already have a suitable level of energy savings policies applied, the focus there should be on implementation. Of course, this applies to all the countries, but it's also really important to emphasize that applying policies with calculated, let's say, end goals in terms of energy savings is really not the same as ensuring that they are realized in practice. So we really need to follow up and check that that these policies are also followed up with evaluations and possibly adjustments to ensure that you also reach what you expect. So in terms of the focus on the countries here, we have one example of just chose Germany as one example, but we have this kind of chart for all the 14 countries, where we give a quick overview of the results of the heat roadmaps, which is elaborated further in the full reports for each of the countries. But what we can see here is how important the heating and cooling sector is in the left-hand side bar. That actually, in terms of Germany, more than half of the demand is going for heating and cooling. Then the green bar is showing how much recommended reduction in space heating in 2050 compared to 2015. Then the red bar, you can see there's the black marker there showing the present level of district heating, and we then highlight an approximate level of where we can see a feasible level of district heating would be in the heat roadmap Europe 2050 scenario. Then again, also go in terms of the heat pumps. I should emphasize that these are sort of overlapping a bit because some of the heat pumps is large-scale heat pumps, which then also covers some of the district heating supply. And this is why you cannot just add district heating and heat pumps and say, okay, now it's becoming more than 100%. It doesn't add up. This is just to show the importance of savings, applying district heating to a further extent, and especially heat pumps, respectively. Also, the two bars on the right, we have renewable energy proportion in the Heat Wave of Europe scenario, and then also how far do we go with the CO2 reductions in terms of the comparison with 1990. Again, the black bars refer to the present status being the 2015 levels. So the differences between, say, the different levels of policymakers is, for example, important when we talk about some key recommendations. One example could be that a national politician might be afraid to apply certain efficiency requirements or restrictions on fossil fuels, or let's say taxation on fossil fuel. I think we've seen examples in the past few days where it's very say sensitive topic for the public opinion to apply taxation on fossil fuels. But on the other hand, we might agree all that it's necessary, at least in the long term, to apply some taxation on fossil fuels, for example. But national policymakers might also be afraid to apply, for example, taxation on fossil fuels in order to, or sorry, might be afraid to apply it because they are afraid that their national businesses will have a problem in terms of competing with other companies outside their country. And this is one example of where we need, let's say, supranational legislation and agree on this on a more common basis rather than individual national actions. Of course, it could be a combination, but it's important to then engage in let's say international agreements on this. And I include local here, or regional, as a topic as well in the first point, because we also see cities, for example, or regions that applies their own targets, even though it's not mandatory from a national perspective or even international, simply because they can see that this is the way forward. And you could also say that this might be an opportunity to let's say increase the number of local jobs and increase the competitiveness of their local businesses, at least in the long run, where you can see that energy efficient supply or production will come. There will be requirements from let's say national and international level, at least in the long run, even though there might be some hesitant national policymakers at the moment. But these kind of requirements will come from the consumers as well. So it's coming from both sides, especially in the long run. And by being front runners in this area, you might actually get a benefit of being more competitive in the long run. And this applies on local level, but even also on let's say national and international level. So these recommendations we highlight here is also something that the European businesses can utilize to ensure that they will be more competitive in a globalized world that will, to an ever increasing extent, require sustainable production, for example. Another topic which also relates both to international, national, and local level is the security of supply, where you, in some municipalities, want to be more, say, self-sustainable and not rely too much on say, importing fuels. The same applies in let's say, national and international level, that you're a bit more, or maybe to a large extent, more certain that you're not in a position where you might be affected by geopolitical changes if you are certain that you can supply your own heat demands with the local production. So this could also be an argument for politicians. In terms of the transition, I should perhaps mention that a general trend is actually that we move towards more capital-intensive heat supply, of course, in turn with lower operation expenses. And this is also something that, say, relates to the security of supply, because you are fairly certain that you have, if you establish a loan and you know what the down payments are, and you have very small operation expenses because you don't apply fuels, but you apply wind and PV power, for example. There are fluctuations, but they are fairly consistent over the years. This is one way of knowing what is coming, and you avoid that you're relying on what will be the gas or oil or biofuel costs in the future. If you take up the loan and make a contract on that, then you know what is this. So that's also an argument. Mandatory heat planning is something that we would recommend on all levels, because the long-term strategy for Europe really needs ambitious targets. The national plans is required in terms of the Article 14 of the EED, so that's also something which the heat roadmaps can feed into. And in terms of local planning, you can see that this is something which really can push things forward. So that should be a mandatory thing, which the national politicians should apply as a requirement for their regions and municipalities. In terms of the local planning, I've just put in here an example from the report, but what is shown here is actually the process, and as you can see, it's the circular process, more or less, meaning that you at the end should then re-evaluate and check if or what can be done to improve this. A thing to highlight here is also that you might need a stepwise approach also in terms of what is your target. You should have an overall long-term target, but you should also make milestones along the way, so you don't set a target 50 years in the future and then hope that you'll end up there, but have steps on the way. A thing to highlight here is that it's very suitable to, or let's say, it has proven to be a good idea to engage in a strategic cooperation with local stakeholders, for example, energy suppliers and installers and craftsmen and financial sector, to really gather all the different stakeholders to make a common strategy, which then also means that all these stakeholders are on board, and you will then be moving towards the same goal. We have a few examples in the report which shows how this can be done and how you can facilitate that process as well. So one of the final points here is that you have, as mentioned, a huge potential for excess heat, and you might want to regulate that from a national perspective. Well, there are also challenges in terms of you need to consider, for example, about taxation. In principle, you want to tax the excess heat in order to avoid that too much excess heat is produced. But on the other hand, you want to utilize this excess heat, so maybe you don't want to tax it because you want to make sure that it's feasible to utilize it compared to burning fuels to get the same heat amount. So this is really a sensitive area which needs careful planning and consideration. And in terms of the process in practice, I just want to highlight that we have one example in the local and regional report, where we show how can you assess where excess heat could be utilized, and how can you investigate where it could be feasible or not to actually utilize it in practice. Sorry, I don't want to go through the whole chart here, but just to show you what is included in the report. And with this, I will leave the floor open for questions.
That would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel, very much for your presentation. Let's see the questions that we have received from the audience.
I think there's a few that can start an interesting discussion. We received a lot of questions actually, so we may not be able to answer all of them, but either way we'll email you if we don't have time to reach them. So please, if there's more that you have, then feel free to put them up and we'll address them as we come along. I think that when we talk a little bit about the local powers that people have, Guy from ESSA asks if you know of any examples that a local or regional authority started banning fossil fuel boilers in new or residential areas. And I think that's one of the key points that we talk about a lot, and that also from the work that, as we were more involved in the technical modeling, that we really look towards trying to eliminate these fossil fuel boilers. So from an implementation perspective and from transitioning to such a place, can you think of any examples that can be used to kind of guide people who are interested in this?
I could mention that actually in Denmark, this has been applied not on a regional level, but on a national level. And there are some differences in terms of the banning of fossil fuel boilers in order to avoid, let's say, affecting people which doesn't have the same amount of different options as others. So one example is that, again, referring to the need of, say, planning and zoning. We have in Denmark already some zones applied from years back, which should be natural gas based, for example. And in these areas, it might still be okay to switch your natural gas boiler to a new one if needed. And one, let's say, footnote on that is because you might not have many other options. In principle, you should have still options for biomass-based supply or heat pump-based supply, but still, it's sort of right now, at least to an extent, still possible. This will also be phased out, but at the moment, it is possible. And in other places where you have an opportunity to connect to district heating, or other places again where you have new built areas, it is already now, and it's been for a few years, not allowed to install natural gas boilers for this. If it's not already decided that it should be natural gas based, then you cannot just do that and apply that. So this is one example of trying to look ahead and say, by this and this year, it's not allowed, and you might even split it up so that new build areas is already now a ban applied, and in existing buildings, you then set an end date for the possibility to, let's say, renew your boiler.
Okay, that's great. I think that gives a good example. I think that there are other examples as well where it depends a lot on the development of, for example, the specific development guidelines of the local authority or of the project that's happening. But it's true that there are also national examples of where these things are regulated, so it's not completely unheard of. There's another question which is quite interesting when we talk about district heating and the combination with deep retrofitting. And it happens a lot where we talk about these kind of things, and it seems like district heating is only an option, is seen as an alternative to retrofitting, rather as something which can happen at the same time. And actually, in the modeling that we've done, it's very much something that we do combine, and we, spatially speaking, do retrofits everywhere, and then in certain areas do district heating. We know that from a technical perspective, that brings a lot of benefits because it means that you can supply the heat at a slightly lower temperature, and that becomes very beneficial for being able to use different types of excess heat and use different types of renewables in a more efficient way, and actually use heat pumps more efficiently to provide the heat for that district heating system. But in terms of implementing these kind of things, and in terms of on a practical level being able to achieve both the expansion of district heating in an area and the deep or the renovation of the buildings in that area, are there good examples of how that can be done? Is there an approach for how to achieve both of those at the same time? Or is there a way in which that is known to be easier than in others?
Well, I would say that in general, the key thing to keep in mind is the long-term planning and the also say short-term planning even, that you consider where is this applicable and where is it maybe not applicable to engage in both things at once. So you really need to assess the feasibility of, let's say, both options and the combination in order to know what is most interesting in this context. I don't have the key examples of where this has been done, say, specifically in practice, but as a general recommendation is that you should then consider both options and think long term and think holistic to make sure that you don't overlook some low-hanging fruits even.
I think we may be able to point to the 4DH project, which was a collaboration between actually an international collaboration between some Scandinavian but also some Asian universities and a lot of businesses actually, which looked at a lot of these things. And I know that they may have some examples from different areas about both the technical results, but also I think about the stakeholder engagement and specifically the citizen engagement, what the people who were living in the buildings thought about this. So that might be useful for those people. We have a question about green or sustainable public procurement as heat as one of the recommendations, and could we consider it? Did you consider it, or maybe does it fit into some of the recommendations that you made either for the national level or for the local level?
Yeah, well, in general, we sort of looked at it from a maybe a bit more overview perspective rather than focusing on the different ways of applying the ownership models. But one thing that we did say explain about here is the difference in ownership between, let's say, local ownership or community engagement in that, or public ownership, and some benefits on that compared to private ownership. With public procurement, yes, I guess we then could consider that if the municipality engage in this kind of strategic cooperation, then it's one of the aspects of that, as I see it, that you do not only focus on the, for example, the public buildings, but you really include that as a key aspect, but really engage in other buildings as well. So it's not only the publicly owned ones that you make sure that you decarbonize.
Okay. It's a bit of a topic hopping, but we have a question actually about heat pumps specifically, and I think that it's about large scale heat pumps. From a technical, well, from the scenario building perspective, so in terms of the technology choices that we made in the scenarios, I can explain a little bit because we talk about heat pumps a lot, but maybe we don't specify enough. When we talk about heat pumps at an individual level, then normally we're talking about heat pumps at a building level. And some of those can be ground source, and some of those can be air source. We know that not necessarily all households or all residences have access to the ground. So we do take into account a level of air source heat pumps there. We do normally think about heat pumps that end up producing warm water, so hot water for both the space heating demand, but also the domestic hot water, because otherwise you have to model two different systems at the time. So we have to have an alternative to produce the sanitary hot water, and that normally becomes very expensive. So when we talk about individual heat pumps, typically we're talking about either ground source or air source heat pumps in buildings. When we're talking about large scale heat pumps, then we in Heat Roadmap Europe didn't model those to use industrial excess heat. This is something which is being done in a project called Reuse Heat, if anyone is interested, which is also funded by Horizon 2020. But because we wanted to stay with the idea that we were using known technologies and technologies that are already being applied in Europe today, the large-scale heat pumps that we model in Heat Roadmap Europe are normally based on some kind of water body, and therefore don't really use the source like industrial excess heat. The industrial excess heat we use is separate from that. The range for the COPs of these is normally around 3.5. So that takes into account the technology learning, but that is based on the application that they are today. When we take geothermal, then we take that separately. So there's work in the mapping that's being done, and there's work in the modeling that's being done to look at the geothermal potentials. And that's either used directly or we compensate for that. So those are a bit the technical parameter of the large scale heat pumps and the small scale heat pumps. I think in terms of the transition element of it, the question is a little bit how we talk about district heating and the application of large scale heat pumps and small scale heat pumps in the context of electrification. As you said earlier, there's a lot of focus on electrification. There's a lot of focus on that being the solution for the heating and cooling sector. But how do we talk about that within the context of also district heating, I think is an interesting question to answer.
Yeah, and I think one point I didn't mention here, but actually something we have included in the report is that one recommendation is to make a strategy, or let's say a planning for what should you do in terms of district heating, country by country on a national level, and then consider where should you promote this, and really make sure that you also connect to the local level to make sure that everyone knows about where should we extend district heating and what is the ambition level here. Because just as you have long-term planning for the electricity grid and you have long-term planning for gas grid, it could be a suitable way to address the need and the, say, properties of district heating as really a long-term investment and an infrastructural investment, which is very important from also a national perspective, again referring to the ability of integrating the various renewables and the ever increasing share of fluctuating electricity production from renewables. So this is one way of trying to put this as a topic in policies.
I think the other thing we might be able to add is that we can quantify these effects. We can quantify what happens here when we compare full electrification with a scenario that does have district heating in it. We received a specific question about this, but actually there was a conversation, I think a few months ago, with some of the grid regulators that we had. And one of the points there is that full electrification is very expensive on the grid. When we talk about the country like Germany, then we're talking about something like 2,000 million more euros to reinforce the grid if we were to go to full electrification. So these are not small increments, and that's something that we can talk about when we talk about full electrification.
So I think we need to wrap up right now, and we can see if we can address the rest of the questions by email. I would like to thank you for sending all these questions and participating in the webinar. The recording of today's session will be available soon on our website and our YouTube channel. Please visit our homepage to learn more about the heat warm-ups and recently published guidelines and the business strategies. And follow us on Twitter to stay updated about our future events. Thank you for attending, and have a nice afternoon.